Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy.
I am Justin Holmes, professor of political science at the University of Northern Iowa, and I am joined today by Professor Ken Katkin from the Chase College of Law at Northern Kentucky University. Before we get started, Michael wanted us to pass on that we are kind of in the process of potentially bringing on a couple more conservatives. Michael has contacted a few of them, and they're going to be stepping up over the next couple weeks to guest host with a few of us and hopefully try to work some of those folks in. So anyhow, Ken, welcome. Good talking to you.
Yeah, it's great to be back. And this is our first time doing the show together. So I hope we can maintain the standard.
It is. Well, I think we'll give it the old college try. So
yeah. So the first story we were going to talk about today, it was big news all week. It probably should have been big news last week, but it dragged out, was the big, beautiful budget bill that finally got enacted about not actually enacted, just passed by the House of Representatives about 5 days after it was expected to, in a kind of drawn out drama. And the final push towards getting it voted started at 1 a.m. And I think they had actually hoped to vote it in the middle of the night when no one was paying attention. But even then it dragged out into the next morning. But now we have, at least from the House, a big, beautiful budget bill.
Yeah, so I think, there are some interesting process things here. That notion of doing it in the middle of the night was quite strange to me, especially because they didn't manage to do it in the middle of the night, for all that. But it's not like this isn't going to be public and scrutinized and whatnot, but that gives it the whole air of, hey, we're doing something a little nefarious and whatnot, which, the optics of that maybe not the best. Yeah, it's passed the House. I have not seen, reason, or I've not seen much about prospects in the Senate, what might change. They are doing this through reconciliation. So, that is an easier lift through the Senate than your typical bill would be, because it's, you don't have to vote cloture on it or anything. So really all they do need is 51 votes. And then, kind of as we saw with the House, there were a few holdouts who either kind of came along or a few voted present, and there were still enough Republicans to squeak the thing through. I'm a little less clear what the dynamics are, in the Senate. Clearly they have a majority there, but, it's not clear if there are any senators that want any particular concessions out of this or not. So, should we?
Yeah, I would say that by my lights, the House the House bill does almost nothing that the American people actually wanted. And we can go through the provisions, section by section of what's in it. But I think that's the big picture. And that's, maybe we'll slow it down in the Senate a little bit. We may see some big changes, because it's the most deficit expanding budget bill in the history of the United States. By conservative estimates, will add about 4 trillion, 3 or 4 trillion. And I think by some estimates will add, more than 5 trillion to debt just over the next decade. And that's at a time when, we already have very high deficits, and this greatly increases them. It throws quite a lot of people off Medicaid, although that is mostly delayed past the end of the year, so that the fingerprints will be a little bit off it by the time it happens. So nobody's getting thrown off Medicaid right away in 2025, but that starts in 2026. It gives massive tax cuts only to the very wealthiest Americans and extends some other tax cuts that were given to the wealthiest Americans in 2017. It There was a lot of drama around the state and local tax exemption cap, and I think it ends up raising that number from 10,000 to 40,000. And we can talk about what that means if I guess we won't know if people are interested, but if we want to. And I don't know, what else did you notice that's in the bill that we should talk about?
I think the other thing that's worth noting is that there's a lot of non-budget stuff in there, which has become sort of a trend over the last few rounds of reconciliation. And I think this is a sort of a symptom of kind of the gridlock that Congress has been in for, gosh, the better part of my lifetime, it seems like these days, but has been exacerbated from kind of about 2014 on, where it just gets very hard to do anything. And so we have these reconciliation rules where for budget things you can pass a budget bill with just a bare majority in the Senate. But what's happened several times now is these get loaded up with all kinds of other things. And so, there are a few in there, and I don't know, which of these we want to get to. But, one that kind of stuck out to me is there's a line in there basically stripping review of government permitting of projects that have environmental implications, that basically, no court is allowed to review decisions by the EPA, et cetera, on permitting. And it seems like, there are a large number of these sorts of provisions in there as well, which, I guess we have the precedent from previous rounds of doing this, but it does sort of, shall we say, fly in the face of doing things through reconciliation in the traditional sort of way.
Yes, some of those, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the Senate, because I think, the way the House proceeded, they didn't really have any. House always proceeds by simple majority anyhow, so they don't have to worry about things like the Byrd rule. But in the Senate, there's going to have to be parliamentary rulings on what can be included in a reconciliation bill that's not filibusterable, and what would need to be done through ordinary legislation, which is filibusterable, which essentially is asking the question, can these lines be included in a bill that can pass by 50 votes, or do they need to be moved over to a bill that would require 60 votes to pass? And I think for the usual test for that under what's called the Byrd rule is whether it affects a spending item, whether it affects government spending or government revenue stream significantly. So when you're talking about the kinds of provisions that you just mentioned about whether there's going to be environmental review of certain private sector activity, that's not really significantly a line of a government funding appropriation or a line of government revenue. So it's likely that the parliamentarian would rule that can't be included in a bill that would be passing on reconciliation. But it just depends how hardball the Senate Republicans want to get in terms of whether they're willing to vote to overrule the parliamentarian about decisions like that.
Well, and that was exactly what I was going to bring up is the parliamentarian. I mean, they can be certainly overruled, and again, I've gotten very little sense of where the Senate's at with this sort of thing. There for a long time, there were a lot of people that seemed to have sort of genuine reverence for the Senate and the traditions of the Senate and such, where, I think they would be very, very hesitant to overrule the parliamentarian. I don't know how many of those are left, especially on the Republican side. The Senate has gotten, well, only on the Republican side, but the Senate's gotten sort of younger and, perhaps more ideological. So I think that would be something as people are watching this, kind of in the next step, what happens there. It is a pretty small, it's a pretty small Republican majority. And so, beyond sort of the parliamentarian aspects, there is also, this dynamic where it does sort of empower people that want to hold out for specific things. The Democrats lived through this with Manchin and Sinema the last, couple go rounds. And so it will be interesting to see, are there any senators that want to sort of extract other concessions out of this? And then, of course, that gets to that difficulty of, getting the House and the Senate on the same page. as far as what kind of that final bill looks like.
I mean, on the filibuster writ large, I'm sure that the Senate will not eliminate it. And I don't think it's just because of reverence for the institution. I actually think it's because of both institutional power, power that the Senate actually has more power vis-a-vis the president if there is a filibuster, and also because of the power of each individual senator that they all want to have some power. But I think institutionally, you've got essentially almost all elected Republicans who don't want to stick their neck out and go against Trump, but you've got a lot of them who don't really want Trump's entire agenda to pass. And so I think letting the Dems filibuster some stuff while every Republican can vote on Trump's side in the knowledge that that's not going to be enough, I think that's a situation a lot of Republicans like and are not anxious to get rid of. It doesn't tell us about whether they'll use particular targeted exceptions in particular cases, though. And I think they have already used one in this budget negotiation because of the way the budget was scored. The 2017 tax cuts added a ton to the deficit and the debt, but they all were set for expiration in 10 years. And so because of that, the budget scoring, if they extend the 2017 tax cuts, those of us out here in the citizenry, we wouldn't experience a change because it would just be keeping the law in effect that's already been enacted in 2017 that we've been living under for 8 years. But from a budget scoring standpoint, that should all be counted as new deficit spending because it would otherwise have expired. And so if they extend it, it keeps adding to the deficit. And on that particular point, the Republicans decided to count that as the zero status quo, as the baseline, rather than to count it the extension of existing tax cuts as new deficit spending. And the parliamentarian ruled against them on that, but they did overrule that one parliamentarian ruling already.
Yeah. And I agree. I mean, something like, this judicial review of permitting stuff, that feels like the thing that I could imagine a non-trivial number of Senate Republicans not being that interested in sticking their neck out on something like that, to keep that in. Although it's also the kind of thing that the public's going to pay attention to sort of the top line numbers and taxes and Medicaid cuts and things of that nature. This is that kind of arcana that few activists are going to be interested in and is important, but in terms of sort of where the public's going to come down on this, fairly unlikely, I would imagine, to have much of a memory for it in a year or two.
Yeah, I think the Medicaid cuts, similarly, I think they're trying to conceal it. They're denying that there are Medicaid cuts, and the Medicaid cuts won't kick in until after a year. But it looks like it's going to kick about 13 million people off Medicaid, primarily through three methods, I think: kicking non-citizens off, kicking able-bodied adults who don't have jobs off, and increasing a lot of kind of difficulty of just going through the registration process to get on, which will kind of kick some people off. And then I think it looks like for people who manage to jump all those gauntlets, the level of spending might not be cut, but that the main savings here is going to be by kicking quite a lot of people off Medicaid through those three different paths.
Excuse me. Right. And I think by targeting those groups, I mean, there are a couple different ways that I think this plays. The basic polling, and I think it will depend on sort of whose framing ends up sort of, taking precedence with the public, as so many things do. The basic framing, the some poll questions out there, do you want to cut Medicaid and Medicare to provide for, tax cuts, is a very unpopular position, especially if, you mentioned, tax benefits mostly going to the wealthy. On the other hand, when you throw in, kind of immigrants, able-bodied, non-working people, those are groups that are not necessarily as sympathetic to the public. And so, if the Republicans are really able to sort of get that language out there, that may mitigate some of the potential public backlash. But, as it stands right now, I mean, it's largely just, people seem to be kind of seeing the cuts to Medicaid, bunch of people, here's a number. and that's what seems to be driving the conversation around that so far. I think the other potential issue here that is concerning or and may have kind of ramifications down the road is what this does for everybody else's medical care, because a lot of health providers they are getting substantial amounts of money from Medicare, Medicaid. When that money is not coming in anymore, what happens to hospitals that are kind of on the brink? Being in Iowa, we have certainly a difficulty with healthcare provision in more rural areas, and I certainly have seen some expectation that these sort of cuts could lead to declining services in some of those areas. Whether or not people buy that's the cause, I mean, it's a slightly more complicated story and a narrative that might, because it's a little wordy, I don't know how much traction that gains. But certainly that's another practical implication of this, is that this spending is not only about the people who directly benefit from it, but to some level it's sort of subsidizing the whole system.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I'm in Kentucky, and there's many rural counties in Kentucky where there in fact are a lot of non-working adults. There's high unemployment, and if those rural hospitals can't collect Medicaid from treating those patients, in many cases they'll either need to be bailed out by state government or they'll need to close, because there won't be enough people coming into the hospital who have private health insurance or even private health insurance plus Medicare to keep those hospitals open. They're mostly already running on pretty thin margins or even losing money and needing to be subsidized already. And so if you take away, significant percentage of their revenue stream, it's definitely going to affect the whole system. Other benefits, we didn't even mention SNAP benefits, but they get cut as well.
And
so,
WIC.
Yeah. And that all is, not only kind of a lifeline for people who don't have enough money to buy food, but the agriculture industry is affected by that as well. Like the agricultural industry typically does benefit from food aid that the government provides to poor people, because then that creates markets for more food.
Yeah, as well as retailers, honestly. I mean, if you look at say Walmart, in particular, I mean, they are doing a fairly robust business in SNAP benefits. So, and that may be, I mean, we have seen in the past some pushback from some Republicans with big agricultural states on exactly those grounds, that this is, because I think something that we often lose when we talk about government spending is that, yes, it's government spending, but then that is also a form of economic stimulus. Those dollars don't evaporate, like they get spent and they get spent on again and spent on again, et cetera. And so, the potential downstream effects of this, I think there are, and I think perhaps in part because these programs go through USDA. But I think there are, kind of a handful of rural Republicans that are a little more cognizant of that. And so I do wonder if you might not see a little pushback on that in the Senate as kind of that version gets negotiated.
Yeah, I mean, you're out there in Iowa, so where's Grassley going to be on this?
Boy, that's a good question. I mean, the thing with that a little bit, Iowa, it is, so much of our corn becomes ethanol anymore. We're very rural. I mean, it would be pork is probably the bigger issue, but so much of our agriculture, we're almost like a petro state in some ways these days. So I'm not sure. I mean, the state government here has been doing various cuts to kind of state food programs and actually turned down some federal summer money the last 2 years as well. So I'm not sure. I mean, I think Grassley would be one that would be maybe a little more savvy about that sort of thing. Whether or not it's enough for him to be a holdout on this, I don't know. But
yeah, and also before we leave just those cuts, I wanted to just mention the numbers. The number $1.1 trillion, that pops up twice in the estimates about what this bill is going to do. $1.1 trillion is the amount of cuts to Medicaid and SNAP, and $1.1 trillion is identical. It's the amount of money that's paid out in tax cuts only for people who make more than $500,000 a year. So if you add up how much tax cuts are being given to people who make more than $500,000 a year, it's at $1.1 trillion. How much is coming away from Medicaid and food stamps? The same $1.1 trillion.
Yeah, and that is, gosh, that is just kind of a gift wrap message to Democrats. I think if you want to sort of play the balance sheet on this as discussing it in terms of the public, that is going to be a pretty powerful message. I think a lot of kind of our politics around spending and taxes are sort of resentment based. And, oftentimes, because the people who are on SNAP or on WIC or getting Medicaid are not viewed necessarily particularly sympathetically, it's often easy to make those cuts, but who else is not viewed particularly sympathetically? That's people making $500,000 a year and more. And when you balance those two off, I do think that's kind of a gift wrap message to Democrats if they have the sense to play it. And
yeah, I think they will, because that's where these these numbers are being bandied around already.
Right.
Yeah.
And to throw out, for if people want to read a little more on this, G. Elliott Morris has a great Substack piece on this yesterday that very much is all about those trade-offs, and he's somebody that's normally a fairly dispassionate analyst in a lot of ways, but I guess he actually grew up on Snap and WIC, and this really has him fired up. But he has this amazing graph that's, kind of the benefits, changes in sort of household benefits, and he scaled in such a way that essentially the bar for the top 1% runs about 5 screens, and the cut for the bottom chunk is to put those two together, I think it's a pretty powerful message. And so if that's something that Democrats can keep sort of hammering home, I think that is something that certainly, I'm not sure that stopping much of this is necessarily going to be in the cards, but I think for 26 midterm messaging, you're going to see a lot of this.
ChatGPT Plus is free for college students through May. Here's the thing. You've got a lot to do between now and then. Studying for finals, writing papers, trying to keep your life on track, and ChatGPT can help with all of it. It can quiz you for your econ exam, make a study guide from your French notes, plan out your meals and study breaks. It can get really specific on how you like to learn. It can even help you come up with ways to stop procrastinating. So from now until summer break, take advantage of all the ways ChatGPT can make your life easier. Restrictions apply.
How does PwC take your company to the leading edge? They bring the sharpest minds in tech to your team, so you can bring the ideas that will transform your business. They're passionate about your industry, so you can walk into any room with every advantage. And they're with you every step of the way, so you can know you're headed in the right direction. PwC builds for what's next, so you can get there now. Get started at pwc.com/us/leading edge.
It does get rid of a lot of the tax credits that have been adopted over the past decade or two, tax credits that support wind, solar, electric vehicle, and nuclear power industries. And, those tax credits have done really quite a lot in speeding up the development of those industries. And green energy is now, a fairly big part of our energy market in the United States because of these kind of tax credits. But I feel like that is going to end up just ceding like the future of those markets to basically to China, which is going to end, still pump a lot of money into development of green energy and electric vehicles and things like that. So that idea that the United States would have an industrial policy that would try to put support into industries that we'd like to see grow here, that's pretty much disappearing with this bill.
Yeah, ironically, this is potentially going to hurt Tesla of all people.
I mean, people used to get an individual tax credit for buying a Tesla.
It was like $10,000 a car or something like that. I mean, not a non-trivial amount, and certainly they've gotten kind of other kind of incentives directly along the way as well. And yeah, I mean, we're already in a situation where the bulk of solar panel manufacturing is coming from China, and suddenly you can't import them here yet, but like China is doing some really impressive stuff with cheap electric cars. And
they say that the Chinese electric cars are better than Teslas, and in Mexico they're selling for about $20,000.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, gosh, you can't hardly buy any car in America for $20,000
Right.
anymore, let alone a fancy pants electric. And yeah, I mean, they may not come to the American market, but these are global companies and global markets. And Tesla has been trying to sell in China, and gosh, that's going to be a problem, competing with BYD and others, domestically there. But Europe, or yep, Mexico, et cetera. So I do think this, these sorts of things are, it feels very, kind of penny wise, pound foolish sort of stuff, because we do, we have this sort of, free market mythology and such, but, a lot of stuff really is kind of propped up by government policy and government spending and things. And I think some of these things, really kind of hasten the demise of our leadership in these sectors. And if we focus on the domestic markets, that's certainly one thing. But all businesses, manufacturing at least, is all international at this point, and we're essentially seeding through these sorts of things. I think seeding any kind of global market for our companies by doing this.
Right. And I think overall this bill, even though, it's kind of, backing off on the idea of trying to support those kinds of industries, it's not getting out of the business of trying to choose winners and losers in our economy.
Right.
It is, tariffs are being used for a big part of that tariffs are going to be protecting some industries that Trump likes and not protecting other industries that Trump doesn't like. And then also, some of the taxing provisions here, like not taxing tipped income, for instance, that's sort of choosing kind of certain kinds of taxpayers based on what their occupation is to shoulder a heavier tax burden, and others to not pay their fair share. And I was talking to a chef last night. I was at a restaurant. I was talking to the chef, and he was telling me that they're really irate that in the restaurant, people who work in what they call the back of the house, cooking, that's not tipped income. And the waiters who work in the front of the house, in a nice restaurant, they make very big tips. And it might already be the case that the waiters and waitresses in the front of the house are earning more money than the chefs in the back of the house, who think of themselves as working even harder. And now the tax rate on the chefs and cooks is going to be higher than the tax rate on the waiters, even if the waiters have higher salaries. So,
yeah, I mean, front of house and back of house never get along anyway, from my brief experience in the restaurant world. I mean, they're always at each other's throats, and don't honk off the guys with the big knives, I think would be,
yes, but this policy, but the bill does that. And and it,
I also, I had talked about this with Jay when Trump proposed it on the campaign trail. And I mean, the other thought that I had, apart from some really high end restaurants, I'm not sure how much that even affects most servers. I mean, because we do progressive taxation, because we've got, various deductions and exemptions and things like that. I'm not sure. They don't have that large of a tax burden anyway. I mean, this is something that I think always kind of gets lost in some of the tax cut discourse. You could cut my taxes to zero, and I'd take it, I suppose. I wouldn't necessarily turn it down, but that's not that huge of a swing. I mean, as a kind of, middle class person, you cut my taxes, 5% or what have you. And that's not a huge shift in sort of my pay, my quality of life, et cetera. And I think, if you're looking at, somebody who's a server at Le Cirque or something, that's a totally different story. Those folks can make lots of money on, giant tips. But your typical waitress at a Perkins or something like that, like this is probably pretty negligible in terms of what they'd get out of it. So
yeah, I was just thinking it has been thought of as a kind of basic precept of tax fairness, that people pay income tax based on their income, and that the government doesn't choose some kind of income is more worthy than other kinds of income. And so two people with the same income. Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, there are some countries that do that sort of thing. Greece comes to mind, and that's a giant problem. Like they have, different rates and exemptions for certain, different rates by occupation and exemptions for certain occupations, et cetera. And, that's a large problem with their revenue stream, is that, and again, it's that picking winners and losers, but then, I think there's the political incentive to, everybody's then going to come for a cut of some sort. And, at some point you just totally destabilize your government's ability to govern on some level. So yeah, this idea, it's very much in line with what you were saying earlier about picking winners and losers, that I think this is not great.
Yeah, that he doesn't want to pick winners and losers, so we're not going to subsidize clean energy, but yet he does want to pick winners and losers as between the waiters and the chefs. So that's kind of my critique there. And then the final thing we should talk about, I think, unless you have others on the budget, is just the deficit busting. It's extreme, and it's actually already affecting the bond market. Interest rates are going up just on the fact that bill passed. There's a great sense that we already have deficit and debt that's too high, and this is going to explode it to an extent that it's really going to crowd out money that could be spent on other things, and so there's going to have to be even more borrowing, and interest rates likely will keep going up now because of this, and so that's another kind of hidden tax on the American people.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, before we leave this, we should talk about the deficit. And I think one of the sort of galling things for me was kind of after the Moody's downgrade. I don't remember who, but it was some House Republican said, and this is why we need to pass the bill, and kind of the rejoinder to that was, no, Moody's actually cited this bill as part of why they were downgrading our our creditworthiness. But yeah, I think this is a very large, very large problem. And it's something that has always sort of gotten under my skin a little bit, is that, these so-called deficit hawks only seem to be deficit hawks when there's a Democrat in the White House, and I mean, Trump ran up the deficit his first term as well. And to give
more than any other. I mean, we should say more than any other president, he ran up the deficit. Yeah.
I'm going to give him a little out, because we don't have a conservative here, today. I'll play a little devil's advocate, but to give him a little out. I mean, some of that is COVID, and some of that is just inescapable. I mean, that was a giant shock to everything. But yeah, it's very odd to me that Republicans kind of maintain this edge with the public on fiscal responsibility when Trump keeps blowing up the deficit, and this bill does really nothing to rein that in. And I don't know if this is. I mean, certainly there's been a perspective out there that we should essentially drive up the deficits to essentially force even bigger cuts in social spending and things like that. But I don't even know if that's the case in this round, if they're looking that far, down the road. So
no, and Trump, I think as recently as March, he was on TV saying, I want to do what's not been done in 24 years. I want to balance the federal budget. We're going to balance it. And instead, at his drum beating, the House just passed the most unbalanced budget in American history.
Well, and spending this year is up year over year, even with the alleged, cuts from Dodge and Doge, pardon.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure what his attitude, I don't know what designs he has on the deficit at this point, and I mean, somebody was Secretary of Treasury or somebody was out yesterday, I think taking the approach that, this is going to grow the economy so greatly that we're going to essentially grow our way out of deficits. But I'm skeptical.
Yeah, right. I think some members of the administration have been throwing around numbers like this will inspire 3% a year growth, and so that'll pay for itself. But what I'm seeing is that almost every estimate that comes from anyone who's not part of the Trump administration says that the bill alone would be, I think one from the Joint Committee on Taxation, for instance, says would increase annual growth by 0.03 percentage points from 1.83% to 1.86%. And that's not putting it in the context of the tariffs. But when you put it in the context of the tariffs, which are also discouraging economic growth, then Goldman Sachs is saying you should expect a 0.5% decrease in growth now, because the negative impact of the tariffs will far outweigh the kind of infinitesimally small positive impact from the tax cuts.
And I do wonder if some of this is not a strategy to try to shift the tax burden away from income taxes onto tariffs. I mean, Trump has, he's always talking about how great the Gilded Age was and whatnot, where that was sort of how taxes were set up. But I think those, and we did see, I mean, last like government revenues were pretty good during the kind of first month of the tariffs, but that's kind of the early stages, and we don't know exactly where consumer spending is going to go. Probably not well, if we sort of keep this up. So yeah, I mean, the totality of these things don't seem like the kinds of, I mean, yeah, you'll maybe pick up some tariff revenue, but on the flip side, kind of the economic impact of that certainly doesn't feel like it's going to promote a whole lot of growth.
No, and the tariff revenue will be tiny compared to the amount of lost revenue from cutting the income taxes. The numbers are just way out of proportion with each other. And what you called the first month of the tariffs, which I guess was April, the goods in the stores were not actually yet subject to the tariffs because they didn't put the tariffs on goods that were already on ships. That it was really taking till right around now before you're really starting to see, and it's not so much in the increases as much, but we're just seeing less stuff on the shelves starting around now.
Yeah, and certainly I just saw kind of a compilation story today, and I mean, it was, Walmart's already talked about raising prices, Target now in the last day, Volvo, it was a whole mess of companies. And so, I think we really haven't, for the most part, seen the effects of that yet, unless you're buying a lot of stuff from Temu or something like that. But, I think that's all coming, for consumers. So,
yeah. All right. You think we drained everything we had to say about the big, beautiful bill?
I think that was a big, beautiful discussion, and it's probably time to move on.
Yeah. All right. So the next thing we were going to talk about was a U.S. Supreme Court decision that came down today, I guess. So we're getting right on top of this here. But it has to do, it's first of all, it's a shadow docket decision, and I can explain in a minute what that is. But second of all, it has to do with the status of the so-called independent agencies that are part of the United States government. So the case is called Trump versus Wilcox. It came to the court on the court's shadow docket, which is a phrase that's sometimes called the emergency docket. But the idea would be that, while we generally think about the Supreme Court, deciding cases after giving them a lot of thought, the parties file briefs, there's an oral argument, the justices deliberate with each other, they all write opinions, and that's kind of the ordinary way that Supreme Court cases are decided.
And just to be clear, I mean, that's like what, like a 6-9 month timeline typically?
Yeah, I would say typically 6 to 9 months. It kind of is slightly varied, but yeah, that's a fair number for that. Maybe a whole year if you count from the minute that the petition is first filed, because people typically ask the Supreme Court to take a case. And so part of the timeline is the Supreme Court gets to decide what cases they want to take. So they're already thinking about the cases.
The cert decisions take a while.
Yeah, even before they agree to take them. And then they take them, and then they schedule an argument and a briefing schedule. It's a slow process. And also they typically don't even start that process until the case has been finalized in all the lower courts. So, so you typically, cases could get to the Supreme Court through state courts or through federal courts. But if they come up through the federal courts, you're typically talking that there's been a trial in a federal district court somewhere. The federal district judge has read all the motions filed by both sides and written opinions about how they should be decided, come up with jury instructions that he instructed the jury, which is the judge's explanation of what the law is. And then all that gets reviewed by a court of appeals, and there's briefing and oral argument there. Court of Appeals writes an opinion, and maybe this happens in a few different courts of appeals around the country all at once. And eventually the Supreme Court takes a case when the courts of appeals start to disagree with each other about what the law is. The Supreme Court sorts it out. So usually there's already an issue that's been percolating around for years. And then the court takes it and puts it on maybe a year calendar or a little bit less.
I'm always struck with some of the famous decisions, like when you look at like whenever the sort of triggering event happened, an arrest or whatever to when the decision comes out. I mean, it's mind blowing how long that is.
Yeah, it can easily be a decade in a lot of these cases. So
absolutely. Whereas this is this is an action from February.
Yeah, that's right. And that's what I was going to say. The emergency docket, which is often called the shadow docket, usually happens before there's even been a case. So typically, rather than a case being decided in a trial court and then appealed to an appeals court, and similar cases like it being tried in different trial courts and appealed to different appeals courts, what happens with increasing frequency in the contemporary Supreme Court, and was actually fairly rare before, except in death penalty cases where there's a little more of a tradition of it, was that as soon as a lower court makes even a preliminary ruling. So like, for instance, today, as we're going to talk about later in the show, Harvard University went to local federal district court in Boston to ask to have a temporary injunction against President Trump's recent order disallowing them from accepting foreign students. So the trial court gave that order this morning, and just the same day that Harvard asked for it, and said, the trial court says, well, we're going to have a trial about this. We're going to find out who's right and who's wrong. But in the meanwhile, before we even have that trial, I'm ordering that the government cannot implement that restriction yet, that Harvard can still admit, for now, foreign students until we can actually hear all the issues out in a trial. So that's a very preliminary ruling that's made before there's even a trial. Now, it's very likely that that ruling will be appealed very quickly right up to the Supreme Court. So that would mean the Supreme Court will be deciding about that decision to stay the Trump's order. They'd be ruling on that just based on what the trial court said, and that would be just based on what Harvard said right up front, but before anyone ever tried the case or filed briefs or made arguments or anything like that. And so typically, there have always been emergencies. The Supreme Court has always had to issue some orders responding to these emergency requests. I mentioned death penalty cases earlier. There was often requests for stay of execution and things like that. And
that makes sense, because that is like the very definition of an emergency. I mean, that's a bell you can't unring at the end. So
right. So typically, before very recently, the way the Supreme Court would deal with requests like that, they would not take as many of them. But even if they took them, they would typically give an order that might maintain the status quo, so that the status quo could be maintained until the case could be argued. And certainly they would only do that if it seemed like, on the state of the current law, that was warranted. They wouldn't use this opportunity of an emergency petition to make big changes in the current law. Now, in a regular, ordinary case, sometimes the court does do things like overrule its own precedents, which make big changes in the law. But they typically only do that, when you've had full opportunity for full argument, full briefing, lower court thinking about this, lower court decisions, proper deliberation. It's very rare to see the court just simply disregard its own precedents in an emergency motion. Usually it just assumes that all its precedents are correct if it's an emergency motion. And, when there's the rare situation where precedents need to be overruled, that's usually saved, for a major kind of case with a major oral argument and lots of briefing. So Brown versus Board of Ed very famously did overrule Plessy versus Ferguson, but didn't do it on an emergency motion. They did it, at the end of a major litigation.
Right.
But today the Supreme Court did reverse an extremely significant 90-year-old precedent in a case that hasn't even been litigated yet, and without any real explanation or argumentation. In the Trump versus Wilcox case, the precedent that gets reversed is one called Humphrey's Executor versus the United States. And what that case had held in 1935 was that Congress does have the power to set up what we would today call independent agencies within the United States government, which are very familiar to us. The Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve Bank is one of them. The Federal Communications Commission is one of them. The Federal Trade Commission is one of them. The National Labor Relations Board is one of them. And these agencies are federal agencies, but instead of being headed up by a single cabinet secretary who works closely with the president, they're headed up by a bipartisan panel of commissioners. And the commissioners have to include members of the president's party as well as members of the other party. And the concept is that they should be staffed up by kind of nonpartisan experts. And then the bipartisan panel should be taking advice from the nonpartisan experts. They don't always have to follow that advice, but at least you have bipartisan input. And that's been a function, that's been a structure of some parts of our government for 90 years. And really before that as well, but it wasn't completely clear that that was constitutional until the court said so in Humphrey's Executor in 1935. But so that's why we have independent agencies in the government. And when Trump came in as part of Project 2025, he had an explicit agenda of getting Humphrey's Executor overruled and completely politicizing all of the independent agencies and making them a kind of partisan arm of his administration. And so to test that, he just started firing a bunch of commissioners whose terms were not over yet, Democratic commissioners whose terms were not over yet, and who are protected by statute against being fired except for good cause. And even if a president wants to say there is good cause, those commissioners are protected from being fired even for good cause unless there's first a hearing and good cause is proved. So
am I correct that he is in this case not even exerting a good cause?
Right. Yeah, he didn't even exert one because he didn't want to go through a hearing. Yeah. So the good cause protections are backed up by hearing requirements. So under the relevant statutes, if the president asserts good cause, he can trigger a hearing and try to prove it, but he can't just fire them. Not until after he proves that at the hearing. So yeah, here in these cases, the Trump, in order to try to politicize the government and really making no bones about it, he didn't assert good cause. He just simply said he won't comply with those statutes. He's firing these commissioners because they are Democrats, and he doesn't care that the statute says he can't do that because he thinks he has a constitutional right to do that as president. Now, that's directly contrary to the old Humphrey's Executor decision from 1935, and it's directly contrary to the way the government has functioned in the 90 years since then. And this morning, the court just simply sided with him and overruled Humphreys. But this was in a two-page order, in a case that hasn't even been argued yet, that came up on the emergency motion shadow docket, and that was barely even briefed at the Supreme Court, that hasn't even been decided below. And I think it's a really very dangerous kind of use of the shadow docket. Like, even if the court felt that they wanted to reconsider Humphrey's Executor, which they could certainly do, they should follow their ordinary practice of letting these issues percolate their way up through the lower courts and be fully litigated there, so that a proper record can be developed and there can be proper deliberation. And I would say this was a very illegitimate, and I would call it corrupt, political move on the part of the Supreme Court, which did it, of course, on party lines.
Now, is this something that is this their final word on this, or is this something that they're going to revisit? Like, is this just that, kind of until this is done, the person stays off, or is this just the end of the road?
Well, it's both. That's a wonderful question. I mean, so formally, it's not the end of the road, right? So formally, the what the court ruled today is that these people that Trump fired, they remain fired while the case is litigated. So they can still litigate the case. If they win the case, they could possibly be ordered to be reinstated. But what the court also said is that can't happen. So let's say the case goes forward in the trial court, and the trial court rules in favor of the plaintiffs and says that, yeah, now you won the case, you're entitled to be reinstated. Well, the Supreme Court has already said, well, they still can't be reinstated then. The government can appeal that case, and while it's still pending at the Court of Appeals, the DC Circuit, the Supreme Court stay would still be in effect. And then if the plaintiffs also win at the DC Circuit, so they would have won at the trial court and on appeal, well, they still can't be reinstated then, because the government would be able to appeal that to the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court took the case, then its current stay would remain in effect. And so then if the Supreme Court took the case, it's true here that if the plaintiffs won then they would get their jobs back. But the thing is that it's so unusual for the Supreme Court in an emergency motion to already assume that its own precedent is overruled rather than following its own precedent, that it just seems absolutely inconceivable that they would do anything other than reaffirm what they just said in today's order and find that Humphrey's Executor has been overruled.
Thanks. Yeah, that was. This is where I love talking to people that are legal experts, because this is not my forte, by any means. One thing that struck me about this, because I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is a 2025 thing. It's also, Trump's being honked off at the deep state, in his first term. He wants a lot more control over the bureaucracy. Sort of the other interesting thing here that has been maybe less remarked upon, but that I think maybe is even a little more nefarious here, is that this basically shuts down the NLRB because they don't have a quorum and they can't do anything. And so by doing this, it's not only about kind of the ability to, which I think is probably something that he would love to have across other agencies, but this essentially renders the NLRB unfunctional. And I mean, this is an agency that he has absolutely no love for anyway. And so that, and I can imagine that, now that this has worked, if I were on the FEC, for example, I would probably be polishing up my resume. But this becomes sort of a way to essentially, without eliminating the organization, which presumably should take an act of Congress, given how they were created, a way to essentially render them powerless. So, this is like a double win, I think, from Trump. And I'll be curious to see, I don't have my internet up right now, but I'm curious to see who's been fired since, this came out 3 hours ago.
Right. And I think you're right about the NLRB. I actually think the Republicans' interest in shutting down the NLRB by denying it a quorum is even older than Trump. And they actually did do that to Obama. They didn't, Obama didn't, fire anybody, but when the Republican commissioners left and one of the Democratic board members, they're called in the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, so they have board members instead of commissioners. But when some of their board members, either their terms expired or just the Republican ones just left after Bush left, the NLRB lost its quorum when Obama came in, and the Republicans would not confirm any of his nominees. And he actually tried to make recess appointments to get that quorum, and the Supreme Court ruled against Obama on that. So he didn't really have an NLRB either. And it seems to be kind of a repeat playbook of Republicans to try to just shut down the NLRB by denying it a quorum. So I think that's an astute observation that you made there.
Well, I think in the interest, do we want to move on and talk about Ross Baraka for a few minutes?
Yeah. So we've got just a few more minutes left in the regular show, but of course we'll be back for the bonus show with a few more stories. But we also saw the kind of weird story this week about the Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Attorney in New Jersey, who used to be Trump's personal lawyer, Alina Habba. They did a fairly theatrical and staged arrest of the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, Ross Baraka, and of a congresswoman from New Jersey named LaMonica McIver, both of whom were involved in a public protest outside an ICE facility in New Jersey. And they were arrested there on what seemed to be such trumped up charges that even Alina Habba's office couldn't bring themselves to go through with actually trying to prosecute them, even though she orchestrated the arrest. And the prosecutors ended up asking for dismissal of the charges against Mayor Baraka, although they, I believe, have still got charges pending against the Congresswoman LaMonica McIver.
As of when I looked this up an hour ago, that was the case, yes.
Yeah. So, the mayor of Newark is permitted by ICE regulations to ask to visit inside the ICE facilities. And he did.
As a member of the House.
Yeah, as a member of the House. And they did ask for permission, and they were granted it. And so they went in on inside the ICE facility, having been invited inside the ICE facility, and they had every permission to be there. And they went in during a time that a protest was taking place outside, and then they came back out and kind of were walking towards where the protesters were so they could address the protesters. When in what clearly seems staged, like a bunch of ICE agents more or less tried to block their way, and then arrested them supposedly for touching the ICE agents. Now, the whole thing was on video, and they didn't touch the ICE agents, and that those were just false allegations. And once the video was presented, it didn't even take the judge. There was a motion to quash the indictment of Baraka. The judge didn't even have to rule on that motion because the prosecutors were too embarrassed, and they just said that they were voluntarily dismissing the charges. But this thing went on for 13 days. So there was 13 days between the arrest of Mayor Baraka and the dismissal of the charges by the prosecutors. And it's just hard to kind of understand this as anything other than a really, really heavy-handed attempt to censor any kind of criticism of ICE or of the administration.
Yep.
Yeah. I didn't know if you had anything you really wanted to add to that.
No, I would tend to agree. I think there's maybe a couple, pieces to this, a couple potential pieces to this, thinking strategically. I mean, yeah, I mean, the both arrests are no good. And it was funny because, I mean, it was one of those things where then there were, I was seeing conservatives online claiming, well, I've seen the video and she hit him. And it's like, well, no, yeah, like that's not a thing. But I think it's a sort of a two-pronged thing. I mean, one is that I'm not sure that they weren't hoping to find a sympathetic judge somewhere to kind of that might actually take this to trial and whatnot. But yeah, I think the bigger thing here is just a chill that this is something you can't talk about. This is something that you can't criticize. This is something that you can't protest, etc. It also reminds me, very much of the judge in Wisconsin, where, I mean, there might be a little more case. I'm not sure, what your feelings are on that, but that, essentially this is a way of, any sort of independent actors from the federal government essentially are just supposed to bow down. And, to my mind, this violates both principles of separation of power and federalism, where, and this does it perfectly in one example, to get both of those. If we think historically about why we do those things, it's to place checks on, other parts of the government, so in separating powers, we don't put too much power in the hands of any one office. And in kind of having, having states and having localities and things, those are meant to be powers that are independent. We're not a unitary system. And so, they have authority as well. And, this feels like just one of a number of actions here taken to try to kind of assert administration dominance, not just over the rest of the federal government, but over, state and local governments as well. And I think that's tremendously concerning. I mean, this one here, it's, you use the word baseless and that's absolutely correct. But, even in cases, I mean, there are absolutely reasons that the federal government might go after, a local politician, bribery and corruption and things like that. But this sort of stuff is not it. And interestingly, this is super concerning.
And under Attorney General Pam Bondi, the Justice Department actually closed down the public integrity section of the Justice Department, which has existed for nearly a century, which is the arm that goes after the corrupt state and local politicians. So they're actually not worried about corruption. That's something they don't want to investigate or prosecute anymore. But
congratulations, Eric Adams. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. But in this instance, I think I don't even think they ever thought that they could get this by any judge, but I think it was just purely about intimidating people that, nobody wants to be arrested, the way Baraka was, even if they're going to end up, being exonerated 13 days later. And the Justice Department I don't even know who the judge was actually, because the Justice Department didn't even try to move it forward. I think that also speaks to the really, kind of corruption of the Justice Department itself, because law enforcement, and particularly the U.S. Justice Department, you talked about separation of powers and federalism, and it's true that those structural safeguards are there, but the Justice Department really has always had quite a lot of power. They always have had the ability, even with all those structural separations there, to investigate people, to indict people, even in cases where they might not get a conviction. They could have done that if they wanted to, but they had norms against it. And the kind of people that would have been confirmed to be U.S. attorney in the past or attorney general would have been very much people of both parties would have had real reverence for the norm that The Justice Department doesn't arrest people or indict people unless they think they can actually get a conviction. They don't speak to the media about the people they're investigating. If they indict someone, they only speak through the indictment, but not otherwise. That all those kind of norms that are really designed to, make sure that the massive power that they've always had are not used, improperly to intimidate people, and that they're really only used against people that deserve to be convicted. I think
Right.
that norm has just completely, totally eroded in the Trump administration.
Well, and one thing I wanted to pull out of kind of what you had said a little bit that was kind of implicit in there, but yeah, I mean, just being arrested, is a burden. Having to hire a lawyer is a burden, et cetera. And interfacing with the legal system, for an awful lot of people, I don't know how well they pay the mayor of Newark, but, and hopefully he had somebody, from the government to defend him. But, I think this sends a broader message. I mean, for so many people, hell, myself included, having to defend oneself through the legal system would be, just financially devastating, so, you're missing, you've got the hassle of dealing with this. You've got the shame of being arrested. You have that brief period of detention. But, just the energy and resources that a person has to expend to try to defend against these things. Again, fortunately, this got quashed early in the process, but, that's still a fairly substantial burden on people. And I think a lot of this is, really trying to send a message in that way that, look, if you don't want to have a bad day, you need to just kind of toe the line.
Yeah, and it's hard to think of any message that it would be more unconstitutional for the government to try to send to people than that one.
All right. Well, does that, I think, bring us to about the end?
Yeah. You want to read the outro for our first show that we've completed together?
I can. So thank you for joining us today. Ken, it's been a pleasure talking to you. So is kind of our standard bit here. If there's anything that we discussed in this episode that you disagreed with or that you have questions about or that you really liked, we'd love to hear from you. Our email is mail@politicsguys.com. You can also reach us through Facebook or X, formerly known as Twitter. Links are in the show notes. There's also our Discord discussion forum for supporters, and I know there's a fairly active community going on there as well. As a supporter, you get ad-free versions of everything that we release, full-length midweek episode instead of just the preview, access to our Politics Guys Discord group where you can interact with Mike, Trey, and often other listeners. And you can support us on Patreon, where you can sign up for the free trial, as well as on PayPal or Venmo, or just write Politics Guys on a $100 bill and mail it to Mike. Support these links in the show notes, and you can also find them at politicsguys.com/support. If you'd like to get our full-length midweek episodes, but are not in a position financially to support the podcast right now, just email Mike at mike@politicsguys.com, and he'll be happy to get that set up for you. Whether you're a supporter or not, we'd appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you're using, as well as share episodes on social media to get the word out. And finally, a very special thanks to our executive producers, Wilmer Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza. Until next week, this is Justin Holmes for Ken Katkin, and we'll hope to see you again soon.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,